Good afternoon, participants, and welcome to the Canadian Association for Club of Rome's discussion this afternoon on thermal networks and nuclear energy, a pathway to decarbonizing building heating. We're privileged to have Dr. Robert Walker as our speaker this afternoon, and I'll give you a brief summary of Bob as per what you've seen on the posting here on this line. Bob is a retired public servant from the Government of Canada. He served as a scientist and a science executive in both the Department of National Defense as well as in other positions in the federal government. He later on went to lead as President and CEO of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and later to the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in Chalk River and its other sites. And he served as ADM of Science and Technology at National Defense and CEO of the Defense R&D Canada. He is presently a fellow at the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society and Policy, and is a member of the Board of Governors at McMaster University. So I'd like to call on Bob to present his presentation today, and as per normal format, keep your videos off and your audio off, and post to the chat if you have any questions or comments. In fact, if you have a question, maybe you could proceed it with a Q, perhaps a capital Q, and if it's a comment, with a capital C. Much appreciated. Over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for those kind words. And a thank you to CACOR again for giving me this opportunity to present to you on another consideration that plays into this enormously complex ongoing endeavor occurring here in Canada and around the world as we try to get our global energy systems to net zero, while at the same time addressing issues of affordability, reliability, security, resilience. This is complex, and what I'm going to present to you today is one more arrow in the quiver that can help in the journey. There is by no means the whole answer, but could contribute, and that is about thermal networks, and as well thermal networks that draw on the heat capacity of nuclear energy to provide a heat source for thermal networks. I would just highlight that this talk is actually one in a series of talks that I've engaged with CACOR over the last several years. In 2020 and again in 2021, I gave talks on opportunities and challenges for new nuclear here in Canada. And I'll be drawing on some of that content here, perhaps again another update. As well, those talks were bookended by an interesting presentation by Jamie Stephen to CACOR on district energy systems as a missing infrastructure for Canada's energy system, where Jamie talked in particular about the advances going on in Europe, which is far more heavily engaged in district energy than we are here in Canada, and in particular the opportunities for biomass. This talk here today is drawing on a project that occurred through 6 months from the end of 2023 into 2024 with a position paper released earlier this year, co-led by McMaster University's Institute for Energy Studies, led by Professor Jim Cotton, the Boltzmann Institute, which is a not-for-profit focused on research and education around thermal networks, and then by experts from the Canadian Nuclear Association. So I'll be drawing on that quite extensively. I realize this is a bit of an eye test, but just to highlight that this position paper was the effort of many players, a core team and an extended team drawn from the associations and organizations I've mentioned, and engaged with governments, associations, thermal network industries, and nuclear energy sector players. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that all of those entities were in full agreement with the results and recommendations coming out of this study, but nevertheless, to make it clear to you that what I'm reporting on here is not just my opinion. Also, before I begin, perhaps it's useful to just put down some some of the acronyms I'm going to draw on here, and we perhaps realize that we typically talk about energy in units of joules, or in watts is the rate of change of energy. And we also talk about energy in watt hours, which of course would be 3,600 joules. Uh, um, Also, in talking about energy, we need to look at different scales. And in fact, scales that are relevant and I'll use in this discussion actually span 12 orders of magnitude, from kilo to mega to giga to tera to peta. And on the right, you see some examples of a typical scale of energy or power that is using one or more of those prefixes here. You'll also at times see where I use a suffix, if it's small e or a small t following a particular unit to indicate electrical or thermal. And a term that will appear repeatedly through my presentation is that of combined heat and power, where an energy source is delivering both electricity and heat. Okay, so into the talk. The place to start is with some upfront facts and assumptions regarding building heating in Canada to get a sense of what the issues are and the order of magnitude of challenges. I'll be referring to data that is both national but also Ontario-based. To begin, where does the building heating sit in Canada's GHG emissions? This is 2020 data, and you'll see that building heating is one of a number of contributing factors, not the dominant one, only about 13%. But what's important to realize is that when we get into urban areas in Canada, building heating becomes the dominant GHG contributor. So it is really an urban challenge. If we look at the data for Ontario and look at residential energy needs, on the left you see what these energy needs are, and you'll see that between space and water heating, that is north of 80% of the residual residential energy demand. And on the right, you'll see that space and water heating is over 90% of the GHG emissions. Where do we get our heat for buildings from? Well, in Ontario, it's natural gas. It's natural gas. It's natural gas. And while we've seen inroads coming, for example, on heat pumps, they're a long way to go to tilt away from the dominant use that natural gas has in the sector, which is particularly tough given that natural gas is also inexpensive. So north of 75, almost 75% residential and close to 90% commercial. Also, it's important to get a sense of how much heating energy do we need. On the left, you see a graphic that simply makes the point that in Canada, we live in a cold climate. These are measures of heating needed in a number of cities around the world. The unit is heating degree days or cooling degree days. I don't intend to define it more, but you can just see from the relative bars what we're talking about here. And on the right, the reality that when you're talking about summer cooling, you're typically trying to deal with a temperature delta on the order of 10 degrees Celsius. Maybe with climate change, that's going a few degrees higher. But in winter, you're typically talking about a temperature delta of some 5 times what that temperature delta is in summer. So the peak heating versus peak cooling is about a factor of 5 difference. So dealing with the heating problem is first and foremost a priority. Now, a way that if we talk about getting back again to Canadian data, just how much is the demand? And 2 things stand out when it comes to building heating. First is the amount of it on average over the course of a year, that the demand for heating is about equal to today's entire demand for electricity, the blue, compare the blue to electricity to heat. As well, we deal with the peak loads that occur, for example, in Canada when it's very cold, the heat demand goes up extraordinarily high. In fact, the peak heat demand in Canada peaks out at around 200 gigawatts. That's 200 billion watts. And so we have this characteristic of building heating demand. It's on average large, but it's also extremely peaky. And what does climate change, how is climate change impacting and likely to impact that going forward? Well, yes, winters are getting warmer in Canada. So that's increasing the average winter temperatures, which is good for heat, for heat demand. But also, we're seeing this increase in the risk of having extended cold spells over large areas through this disruption of what's referred to as the polar vortex. We saw polar vortex centers this last winter, where we actually had three grid alerts. Grid alerts occur in three provinces where there was risk that the energy system could not meet the peak heating needs of those provincial customers. The point here is that energy system designers need to build capacity to meet peak demand. We'll get into this a little later, but the reality is that while battery storage can help to a degree, it is an enormously expensive undertaking to build battery storage at the magnitude of peak energy that's needed. And of course, it's very short duration, typically capacity measured in hours. This data from my colleagues at the Boltzmann Institute tells a fascinating story. This is a snapshot of the actual electricity demand in the province of Ontario, the blue data, over a 2-year period, July 2018 to July 2020. So this is actual data. On the red, what the Boltzmann team did is went back and used historic weather data and understanding the Ontario grid to say, well, what happened if we replaced gas with the use of heat pumps? And we had a mix of heat pumps where about 30% of those customers had ground source heat pumps and around 70% had air source heat pumps. And what you see in red is what that modeling shows is the dynamic of the heating demand over the course of those 2-year periods. And so you're going through two winters, and you can see these extraordinary peaks in demand. So the average demand in Ontario's electricity system today runs just a little north of 20 gigawatts, around 23 gigawatts. This shows peaks that go up to 60 or 70 gigawatts, a significant increase over what would be required. And so that puts enormous pressure on the need to overbuild the electricity system to meet those peaks, where in fact a large part of the time that overbuild is being underutilized. Then it comes back to the cost of electrification through heat pumps, if we go that approach. If you see here, oftentimes when we talk about heat pump costs to customers, we're talking about what it is cost to the residential owner of the capability. So you see in orange here, the second bar in, air source heat pumps are cheaper than ground source heat pumps. But what we often overlook is the cost to the grid to actually add clean electricity capacity to be able to supply that electricity. And in particular, because air source heat pumps have a performance that degrades as you go to very low temperatures, there is a need for that overbuild that I was referring to earlier. And the capital cost per house, only part of it being borne by the customer, the rest is actually borne by the taxpayer. And these are big numbers. For district energy systems, you can see in green what would be the cost of installing the district energy system, the water pipes in the grounds and connecting it to the house. And in blue, because you have to pump water, and you have to move air in the house, there's needs for electricity here, but a small fraction of what's required for electrification of the building heating. On the right, it says, well, hold it now. What if I could retrofit my house and reduce demand dramatically? Well, there's costs of doing so. These are estimated costs to retrofit buildings to actually reduce the heat demand by as much as 50%. The error bars on these graphs are large. I mean, Boltzmann indicates that there's many factors that play into this with some uncertainty, but broadly the trends are indicative of what the problems are. Well, one of the arguments we hear here is, well, as everybody moves forward and retrofits their house, then the heating demand will decrease as we move forward. But the other thing we're seeing is that there's already a demand to grow the building stock in our country as immigration continues. And over the next 25, 30 years, that immigration is expected to continue. So the general assumption in modeling the future is that our heating demand will remain about flat, where the growth in building stock is offset by the reductions in heating demand for a particular building. This may be optimistic, and if so, what are the options to get us there? So what are some of the things we need to address to deal with this issue? First is this recognition that building heating is a big part of the GHG agenda. This is Ontario data. Another reality well, that's a key point to make here, is that a lot of the energy that is produced in Ontario ends up being lost to the environment. This is typical of energy systems around the world, but in Ontario, it's about 60% of the energy we generate through electricity, through natural gas heating, gets lost to the environment. We also have a reality where we try to bring in variable renewables that leads to curtailment of base load supply. And we know we need to increase electrification, for example, to deal with transportation electrification as much as 2 to 5 times over what we have today. And this is a segue then to a discussion on thermal networks, that today the total capacity for Ontario's natural gas heating demand is close to 200 terawatt hours. However, we're actually not utilizing or losing to the environment almost 400 terawatt hours. And if you look down the sources that are being lost, the one at the bottom, Ontario's nuclear fleet is actually emitting to Lake Ontario and Lake Huron about 250 terawatt hours of heat, more than the entire heating demand of the province. So with this, let's switch to a discussion of thermal networks. What are they? Well, a thermal network is an infrastructure. It's about district energy systems, but district energy systems is public utilities. It's a network of shallow buried insulated water pipes. Yes, the buildings can be both consumers of heat, but also prosumers of giving heat to be used by others. And an enormously important concept in thermal networks is thermal energy storage, where the capacity for both peak and seasonal storage is comparable to what we have in natural gas. And it's an emerging technology in Canada, with about 2% of our heat demand being provided by district energy. In many European countries, Northern European countries, that's at 50% today and growing. So I'm going to use this graph on the right here to just build a bit more around what I brand as the 6 big ideas around thermal networks. So if you bear with me, I'm going to build this a block at a time. So first, district energy systems. I've talked about those. That's the infrastructure that delivers heat to new and existing non-rural buildings. This is an urban solution. It's operated as public utilities. The reason you do that is because the paying for the infrastructure, including the connections inside the home, are paid through rates. This does not require homeowners to make capital investments. Early DES systems were steam-based. They are now hot water based, that's generation 4, typically 70 to 90 degrees Celsius, or ambient temperature, typically 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. There are generally, today in Canada, their energy sources are natural gas, but migrating off of natural gas is through the use of clean heat sources. and by harvesting existing clean heat. And this concept of harvesting is the next big idea. And there are many ways that you can use, for example, low-grade heat sources from building air conditioning, wastewater, data centers, hockey rinks. We can use combined heat and power from CHP generators, and nuclear being an important one, but also biomass, solar thermal collectors, geothermal mines. There's many heat sources out there that could apply. That's the second point. The third here is the big idea around thermal energy storage. There are a variety of technologies that give a variety of capacities to address short-term to seasonal variations in heat demand. The cost of these systems are a small fraction, as 1% or less of electrical storage, and they can store heat that is generated in the summer for use in winter. There are actual seasonal storage, and you have other types that can actually buffer between heat supply and diurnal demand fluctuations. I'll come back to this with some examples in a moment. An enormously important point is that when you combine thermal networks with combined heat and power, or CHP plants, be it nuclear or biomass, you can actually turn these plants into providing dispatchable power, because when the electricity demand from that CHP plant is reduced, for example, through wind and solar, you can actually take the heat from that CHP plant and store it thermally, and then use that thermal energy at another time for providing building heating, for example. Consequence of this is you reduce curtailment of those baseload generators, and you improve the utilization of variable renewables, wind and solar photovoltaics. Then it's into integration, ways that you can use smart grid technologies to provide end-to-end electronic monitoring and control, how you're using your thermal energy storage, adjusting water temperatures, and an enormously important concept is that of thermal corridors, where you're actually connecting district energy systems within cities or to thermal energy storage systems, and connecting to large heat harvesting, such as a nuclear power plant. And the distance you can do this economically are up to or more than 100 kilometers. And finally, it's how to connect to your building. These connections for hot water to district energy systems require only modest investments in building HVAC, heat exchangers, air handling units. If you've got steam in your building, it's a bit more challenging to make the conversion. And the strategy there is that when that steam-based HVAC needs to be changed out, that's where you change out to the systems we're talking about. So there you see in one chart the idea of the 6 big ideas around thermal networks, and let's build some examples on this. Where do you begin with thermal networks? It's all about heat map planning, or heat planning rather, understanding where your systems are where your heat sources are and where your heat demand is. This is an example produced by McMaster's Institute for Energy Studies. This is actual data, and you'll notice the various dots indicating a particular heat demand that's either dominant for heating or dominant for cooling, or is balanced. And you'll see, not surprisingly, most of these sites are heating dominant. I made reference earlier on to that example showing about 70% of the modeled energy system using air source heat pumps. Where does that come from? This is an enormously important observation that typically for the economics of thermal networks to work, you need a certain population density, and you'll see that gray bar indicating where the population density is considered sufficient for a thermal network to work, and that's on the right. And on the left, the argument is that you'd go to a ground source heat pump because it's a more of a rural area. You typically have more land available. This plays into a number of the concepts I know that Art has been working on in microgrids. And you'll see here the various provincial data. And what it shows is that, at least in principle, about 70% of Canada's population in urban areas has sufficient density to be viable for thermal networks to work economically. They exist. Here is a chart of one that perhaps you're all familiar with, which is Enway's thermal network in the city of Toronto. It's using this very innovative deep lake cooling system for cooling many buildings in Toronto, but also for heating. And the big innovation on the left is the well, which is a tank thermal storage. It's large, and it provides it's a repository for cool water in the winter, in the summer, and hot water in the winter, for making that system work. A few thoughts on just what they are in practice. Yes, they're pipes. They're typically shallow buried, pre-insulated. Yes, you've got to put them in place. It's not dissimilar to water and sewer installations going on in the city, or electrical. It's typically installed above other municipal infrastructure. Freezing is not a problem. We've been doing it for decades. And the important here is the cost to install those systems, running in the range of 1,000 to 3,000 kilowatts, is about the cost of upgrading electricity system distribution capacity in cities, should we go to extensively, for example, to heat pumps. The technology for installing is evolving. It's horizontal drilling, use of PEX pipes, flexibilities to go around utilities, trees, and importantly, not surprisingly, of course, rights of way are important. Where are you allowed to do this? So cooperation with cities is pretty important. And what about the requirements to connect to buildings? Here's on the left, you see a typical energy transfer station in a residential home. These replace your existing heating equipment. Essentially, your hot water tank and your furnace come out, and this replaces it. Typically, the footprint for your energy transfer station is less than it is for the furnace. And you use heat exchangers for on-demand domestic hot water, so it's tankless hot water. And these components typically cost less than a gas furnace and hot water tank. And importantly, the cost of those would be built into your monthly connection charges to the thermal network. We can have a discussion on the roles of cooling and all of this, but typically cooling is not seen as a major issue at least you may have different opinions, but the typical use of electricity-based air conditioning would be the case. There may be certain circumstances where bringing cooling into the grid may make sense, such as occurs in Toronto with its deep lake solution. I've mentioned a number of times thermal energy storage. Here's a broad overview of the four core technologies. This is all state of the art. It's all available. It's all costed, from tank to pit to aquifer to borehole. Each have advantages. Tank and pit tend to be more short-term. Aquifer and borehole tend to be your seasonal storage. Practical examples, here's a tank thermal storage. On the left is a system that Markham has in its district energy system. This one tank has got a 40 megawatt capacity. And on the right, you'll see I made reference to Enway's The Well. And this is, you see it in construction back around 2020. This is about an 8 million liter water tank, if you like. As I said, it's not seasonal energy storage, but it is short-term energy storage to help with both heating of the systems on the Enwave thermal network in the summer and cooling in the winter. Also, this idea of aquifer and pit storage. It turns out that Ontario has many saline aquifers mapped in green, and there's many places where pits could work, and the gray indicates that essentially that boreholes could work anywhere. The point is that the geography to provide these energy storage is readily available, at least in this part of the country. I'd have no reason to suggest it wouldn't be in other parts of Canada. So if we come back to that chart I showed you earlier, what would happen if we, instead using 70% air source heat pumps, we used 70% thermal networks? And you'll notice that we've dramatically reduced the need for expanded capacity of our electricity grid to meet that demand. It is higher, there's no question. You can see it's higher than what it was before, but nowhere near what we were experiencing in the earlier modeling. So to summarize, what do we get with thermal networks? Potential benefits: harvesting of clean residual heat. In other words, we don't need to generate more heat. It's there, let's use it. The use of a utility model to finance building connectivity, so we're not requiring capital investments for the energy source by homeowners. We got heat storage that's economical at both short-term and seasonal scales. These are market-ready solutions that provide and help with grid modernization. And finally, we can leverage other strategic clean energy investments such as nuclear, which I'll come back to in a moment. So in summary, the big opportunity: this is another decarbonization pathway. It has environmental, social, and economic benefits. It could be a backbone solution. It could heat up to anywhere from 50 to 70% of Canada's buildings by 2050. And the cost estimates to doing that compared to the need for an overbuilt electricity system would be in hundreds of billions of dollars. So that's significant and needs study. There are challenges, of course, and some of those are pretty obvious. We've got a small footprint today, 2%, so we're talking scaling that up 20 to 30 times. We've got about 10 million buildings in urban areas in Canada that would need to be connected, and we need to do so while we mitigate the disruptions to urban infrastructure for the installation. And sitting all on top of that is the supporting policy and regulatory frameworks, just as we have today for electricity and gas networks. So with this, let's just wrap this talk up then by coming back and say, what about the opportunities with nuclear energy? So the place to start, and perhaps a follow-on from talks I've given to CACOR prior, is that Canada is a big player in nuclear energy, and it's on a path to have more. How much more? It could be as much as 3 times. That would be about 50 gigawatts electric. Last year, the province of Ontario, its independent electricity systems operator, forecast that we would need about 18 gigawatts electric of new nuclear by 2050. Some of the commitments on how to do that have already been made. You'll see on the right an aerial view of the Darlington site, and up in the top right is the Darlington plant, which is in year 8 of a 10-year project to refurbish the 4 CANDU reactors on that site. That project is on schedule, 10 years, and it will complete in 2026, and it is on budget. The budget for that project is $12.8 billion, and so on schedule and on budget. And I'm using that with the word nuclear in the sentence. That's an important observation. And on the right, you see the site preps to put on the same site 4 grid-scale small modular reactors. These are boiling water reactors that each would be 300 megawatts. So we're seeing the deployments being planned, or discussions on how to plan them underway for both large and small new nuclear. And the point we're raising here is that because nuclear produces it produces heat. You turn heat into electricity, but you can also use some of that heat for supplying heat to thermal networks. So it can both service thermal networks and that's what we do with large nuclear, such as a nuclear power plant, such as Darlington, and be integrated into thermal networks by actually putting a smaller or micro modular reactor right inside the thermal network. Let me be clear, nuclear is not the only way of decarbonizing thermal networks. We need it all. The variable renewables, biomass, hydrogen are all possible and necessary. Nuclear is one option. And in the study, we suggested that it could be as much as 25 to 50% of the option. So just a couple examples of what we're talking about. Lots of talk around small modular reactors, but large new nuclear is also in the game. Large, small, we're going to need it all. Large reactors in the class of what are referred to as generation 3 plus, passively safe. They will shut off with loss of all electricity to the reactor, and they're modularly constructed. Two examples that would be in play here for large nuclear in Canada are CANDU and the Westinghouse technology. These are both generation 3 plus. Capacity factors are impressive. Lifetimes are long. They have load falling capability, and they can be operated in combined heat and power. And here in the late 2023, Atkins Realis, who holds the license for CANDU technology from AECL, has introduced a new product called Monarch, which would be a 1,000 megawatt electric plant with a 70-year lifetime. So that's in play. Also, many opportunities for small modular reactors. This graph shows the four main types of SMRs that are in play. The one on the left says light water reactors. Is better to refer to it as water-cooled reactors because, of course, the acronyms on the bottom left here are pressurized water reactors, boiling water reactors, and pressurized heavy water reactors. So these are all possible. High temperature gas cooled reactors, molten salt reactors, fast neutron reactors, each have their advantages. They operate at different temperatures and typically require enrichment of uranium fuel, low enrichment, with the one exception being the pressurized heavy water reactors such as CANDU or derivatives of CANDU, which can operate with no fuel enrichment. And my message to you is the bottom line. We have actual designs for all of the four main SMR types that are in play in Canada as we speak for multiple energy markets, electricity for grids and microgrids, for hydrogen production, and for both industrial and building heat. And today's discussion is about building heat. So what would a scenario look like to bring large nuclear to a thermal network? Well, the place to start is imagine we have a nuclear power plant that's providing electricity to electricity grid. Those are typical. You're providing hundreds to thousands of megawatts electric. The Bruce site up on Lake Huron is I think now the second largest nuclear power plant in the world, and it's providing 7,000 megawatts electric to the Ontario grid, but it's also rejecting a whole lot of heat into the lake. And the typical rate for a CANDU reactor is about two units of heat rejected for 1 unit of electricity provided. So there's lots of heat there that is being rejected to the environment. Now imagine we make that reactor CHP capable. To do so, you're not touching the nuclear island, but you've got to make some adjustments in your steam handling to allow one to bleed off and use that heat. There is a small price that one pays for the amount of electricity you can generate. I'll talk about that in a moment. And so now we've got municipalities some distance from that nuclear power plant, and we connect them through the concept of a thermal corridor and bringing lots of that heat across at distances up to as much as 100 kilometers. With along the way the seasonal thermal energy storage, which provides that important buffer so that You're storing up the heat in the summer when the heating demand in the municipality is low, and then you're drawing on it. And of course, helping with dispatchability by when you have more sun, more solar or wind on your grid, then you can put more of that nuclear power plant's heat into that thermal seasonal storage. And how much capacity might the ambition be here if we look by 2050 of having maybe 3 to 5 nuclear power plants providing somewhere on the order of 5 to 10 gigawatt thermal of clean heat to service accessible thermal networks. So there's a sense of order scope of what we're talking about here. Is this feasible? Well, the message is clearly it is. In fact, of the global fleet of nuclear reactors around the world, about 10% of them are currently configured to be providing combined heat and power for district heating. That's about 500 reactor years of experience, so others have done it. Yes, you've got to be careful in your design to make sure that you've isolated your nuclear island from any possible downstream radioactive contamination. This is done through what's called a transformation plant. Again, it's known how to do it. It's a question of doing it. And that you can see on the left here, you have your nuclear power plant, and you can see how we're bringing the energy out of the reactor, the heat, into a turbine to generate electricity, and we're bleeding off a certain amount of that heat to go into our thermal corridor, which has got a length of perhaps up to 100 kilometers, pumping that water to serve a number of district energy systems, and then returning the cool water back in a closed loop. That's the principle. Here's an example of a long-standing capability. This is one in Switzerland at the Besnau nuclear power plant. This is servicing a network of about 85 kilometers. I believe there's 19 communities that are being serviced by this one reactor. And that's been operating since the mid-1980s. And here's a really innovative idea that's being advanced in China. I must admit I haven't gone back to update it where it is in its planning, but China has a big problem. It's more focused right now on air pollution from coal-fired power generation than it is on GHG emissions. But it has this reactor on the ocean here. It's a 4-unit, 4 Westinghouse type reactor, so it's about a 4,000 megawatt electric plant. But what it's planning to do is use that plant for the generation of fresh water from salt water, heat up the water, the fresh water, and transport it over this network to a number of cities at distances, in this case up to 123 kilometers, where it will deliver both heat for district heating and drinking water. So fascinating innovation. And so how to summarize where we are with this opportunity on large nuclear or grid scale nuclear? We're planning grid scale new nuclear in multiple provinces, in Ontario, in Saskatchewan, in New Brunswick for expansion, and Alberta's seriously considering this. Others have done it, learned their lessons. We can get heat at long distances from nuclear power plants to thermal networks that can use it. There's these modern reactor designs typically offer combined heat and power as an option. The economics require only a modest price for heat. I made this reference earlier, but as a typical rule of thumb, for every 6 units of heat that you want to use for a thermal network, you lose 1 unit of electricity. Now, yes, you've got the cost of implementing, for example, a thermal network, a thermal corridor to consider, but typically having a price of that heat back to the nuclear power operator of about 1/6 the price of electricity would make it economical. And that's well within reason of what it would take to make this work financially. Yes, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and have one source of nuclear power plant providing thermal networks. The question, what happens if that nuclear power plant is in an outage? How do you deal with that? There's ways this can be dealt with. And the capital cost to the nuclear power plant to make it CHP compatible are incremental to the very large capital cost to build the plant. So to put this in perspective here right now, and in our study, we were we didn't get into actual cases, but the decision has been made to refurbish the Pickering site, relatively close to Toronto, but the 4 units that would be refurbished, to put it in perspective, provide enough heat to heat the entire city of Toronto. So you've got N-wave, there's opportunities to at least partially feed heat from Pickering, should the commitment be made in the refurbishment to make it CHP compatible, to move in that path. The second example I want to talk about is now what happens if you bring small nuclear and actually integrate it into the thermal network. And so you imagine you've got a number of municipalities. You see my same schematic here. And this little red circle is actually a small modular reactor. Or more typically in these applications, the acronym is micro modular reactor, which is nothing more than an SMR with an output that's typically lower than about 5 megawatt electric. You're operating that reactor in combined heat and power. So the electricity goes to a grid or to a microgrid, and the heat is available for that thermal network. And what are we talking about here? Now we're talking about from maybe 1 to hundreds of megawatt thermal, plus, depending on the temperature of that SMR, about 30 to 50% of that thermal energy is also available in electricity. And an example that's worth, and so now we have to look at this working with the economics by considering both the price of electricity and the price of heat. And an example worth considering is there are certain reactor designs that are heat only. For example, Finland is developing a heat only reactor at about 50 megawatt thermal, and considers it to be a potential economic solution for its extensive thermal network structures in most Finnish cities. So, and the ambition here would be by 2050, you'd have some hundreds of smaller micromodular reactors providing about the same order of magnitude of thermal energy to thermal networks as what we saw for large nuclear. And the total of those together would be somewhere in the range of 25 to 50% of Canada's thermal energy needs. So to summarize, so we're moving forward with small and micro nuclear deployments. I indicated there's many markets that are being pursued here. Each of these small and micro designs offer improvements in safety and performance. They're simpler, they're smaller. They have a very small emergency planning zone, typically measured in meters. And of course, by having a large order book for these reactors going into multiple thermal networks, you can play into the economies of multiples by factory production and reproduction of these modular reactors, therefore driving down construction costs. The study that I made reference to in the position paper ended with a suite of recommendations for industry and policymakers. I'll come back and highlight a couple of these. First, for governments around policy recommendations. What would we think should be done over the next 2 to 3 years to begin the journey? Shaping out what success would look like by looking forward to about 2050, and then a roadmap to get from where we are to where we would want to be by 2050. Let me just highlight, to wrap this up, a couple of those recommendations. First, the policy recommendations, 6 recommendations. The first is we've got a whole lot of education and consultation to go on here with both policymakers and energy system designers, but also the public, and understanding what thermal networks are and their acceptance of distributed energy resources, including nuclear combined heat and power. The second is that recognize that residual heat, otherwise being lost to the environment today, is actually a strategically important form of energy, and that we, by promoting its conservation and reuse, it provides a key enabler in our net zero transition. The third is to formally recognize that thermal networks can be a critical infrastructure, just as we have our electricity and gas infrastructure, that bringing thermal networks at scale can in fact provide heat sources that are affordable, reliable, and accessible. Adopt this concept of a utility approach, which, among other things, amortizes the funding of the infrastructure through usage charges. We need, as I already alluded to on several occasions, integrate the governance, planning, and operation of the combination of electricity, gas, and thermal network infrastructures. Those synergies are enormously important and add to efficiencies and greater affordability for Canadian taxpayers and ratepayers. And finally, as we roll forward with new nuclear in Canada, look at the business case for configuring nuclear power plants, whether at a large scale or small or micro scale, for combined heat and power as a potential contributor to the clean heat needs of thermal networks. And finally, what might our notional roadmap look like? There's enormous devil in the details here. I understand that. But if you start with where we are today, the first step, of course, is to create or expand the footprint of district energy systems, bringing in thermal energy storage. Then we need to make sure we're decarbonizing the energy sources, including the harvesting of rejected heat, bringing SMRs and micromodular reactors and combined heat and power, adding in the grid services, and then from that, building the citywide thermal network interconnections through thermal corridors, and that ultimately allows us to connect large thermal energy sources such as nuclear power plants to complete the cycle. That together gives us an ambition that could be as much as 40 gigawatts thermal, or about 140 gigawatt peak by 2050, in building up Canada's building heating demand at what our analysis would suggest at a lower cost, more affordable to ratepayers. It doesn't require enormous upfront investment in building infrastructure, and the technology to do all of this is off the shelf today. So with that, that's the talk, and you'll see here, you can do a scan of the code there to get access to the position paper should you wish to read more. So with that, I'm going to just close my screen here, and we'll go into our Q&A. Okay, there we are back again. So Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you, Bob, for a very interesting overview of the study and your views on it. We're now going to go into our question and answer and comment period, if you like. And just to begin, I will ask the first question, and I'll put John Legge on cue for the next. I'm just wondering, Bob, given what you've spoken about, beyond the study's recommendations, which you were just summarizing, how do you envisage getting this initiative before policymakers? And I view it in 3 categories. One is, of course, the nuclear industry itself. Two would be the regulators of both nuclear and electricity and any other regulations involved, and potentially political decision makers, both at the provincial and federal levels.
So thanks, Peter. And of course, anytime an idea that a big idea like this takes time to gestate and land, I guess the first point I'd make is that for thermal networks to work, it requires very much the concept of cooperative federalism to work. The federal government has a role to play here, uh, um, but frankly, so do provinces, municipalities, and indigenous governments have roles to play. In my mind, one could argue that the first voice you want playing into this is actually at the municipal level. I made the point that the GHG problem in Canada's urban areas is largely building heating. And what we have here is a solution that provides essentially an affordable way for many municipalities to get where it needs to go. But it would need support provincially and federally to make these systems work. One is about regulation, but frankly, others about smart investment here. So our view is that one needs, in fact, a multiple government kind of approach to socializing this. It's also important that one reflects on what's working today. I've talked about the systems in Toronto. There's others in Hamilton, in Markham, here in Ontario. This is working. It's out there today, but I would say many energy system planners don't realize it's working because the only thing they think about is electricity and gas, because there is no public utility called thermal networks. And I think that bringing the opportunity of thermal networks into our provincial system operators in parallel with that political engagement are two of the pieces that need to work here. So, however, it's all about, frankly, doing what I'm doing today and sharing with you folks and your networks, personal networks, that there's opportunities here that merit consideration. And I know, for example, CACOR has been very proactive on the opportunities around microgrids, and I think there's synergies that can be realized here between thermal networks and microgrids, with or without nuclear, that could play into CACOR's policy agenda as well.
Good, thank you. John, you can either read your question or pose it as you wish in terms of a verbal ask, and Art Hunter is on deck.
Okay, thanks, Peter. That was quite well, you covered a lot. I could call you Bob. You talked about at the beginning of your talk, I think it was two, and I may be a bit off there, two grid alerts. And I have two questions. I think the first one, the answer is probably no to it, but I don't know. Is the Ontario grid able to simply dial back on the demand? And I think that's too easy, and the answer is probably no. And so the second follow-up would be, if it's not possible to simply dial back, how do the grid managers deal with the pressure of, and I apologize for the poor vocabulary, but the pressure of losing the grid? How do they do that?
Wow. So I make two comments here, John. First off, when it is extremely cold in Canada, the first pressure is not on our electricity grids, it is on our gas grids, our natural gas grid. And one of the things that is rarely appreciated is just how much natural gas reserve capacity one has in storage in Canada. Here in Ontario, we have a reserve capacity that's on the order of 140 gigawatt thermal of gas storage that's there to be called on demand when the demand, when we have a disruption, for example, in the polar vortex. But there are still demands through electricity uh, that play into this as well. And when you have the unfortunate situation of a polar vortex, which is in the winter, and you have low wind, and you're using demanding wind, or you have a low solar, you're demanding, then you have a problem. And that's the only way the grid operators can deal with that is by shedding demand. In other words, asking people to stop using electricity or ways, or frankly, a lot of curtailment occurring in the private sector through industries' willingness to curtail. So it's an enormously complex problem. What we're trying to say is let's not compound the problem by overly demanding the electrification of building heating, particularly in urban areas where the use of the much more efficient ground source heat pumps is less practical. And while technologies for air source heat pumps are getting better, the simple reality is they're still not going to deliver the efficiencies that you would otherwise want to have when it's minus 30 degrees. So that's why we think and there's going to be building electrification to some degree, but if you bring thermal networks in, then you have these are complementary technologies that can help sustain. Let me say, I know that microgrids are a big part of this as well, and that you don't have to have it all on the grid. You can go to microgrid solutions, and within that, you can also have heat solutions within that local district energy system serviced by the microgrid as well. John, I hope I sort of answered your question, but it's a complex question.
Well, I figured it was, and I think I followed a certain percentage only, but I certainly got the drift of what one does. But it's far off because I certainly did not realize that the main response is the great natural gas reserve that's there, and that's obviously it gives a great degree of assurance.
I just noticed that one of my colleagues that co-authored the paper, Martin Green, who's with the Boltzmann Institute, has joined the call, and there may be a time here, Martin, where I'll reflect back, and you might want to add some additional commentary to the question here. But let's just move on here for the time, Peter, and I'll reflect back to you and Martin in a moment to let you have a say too.
Okay, well, thank you, John, for your question, and Bob for the answer. And now it's Art's question, and I guess I'll have Dave Pollock on deck for your first two questions, Dave.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Art.
I'm particularly intrigued by thermal networks and harvesting, as well as delivery. I look at what's already in the ground and what already exists, and every new development is requiring both natural gas and fresh water delivery, as well as storm sewage and waste sewage removal. So these are four hard pipes, as it were, that already exist. And it strikes me in terms of thermal network harvesting, clearly you can cozy up to all four of those in some way. I know that there has been some work done on harvesting thermal energy from storm sewage and waste sewage. When you think about it, every building in an urban environment is right beside and connected to a very highly engineered waste sewage system, and very close as well to storm sewage. And in many cases, in older parts of the the cities, they're combined as one. And so there's near constant flow in much of it. And of course, there's peak flow during storms, etc., for the storm surge. Now, with that all said, is there any work that's going on that says clearly we must have our thermal networks running in parallel with what already exists? And I'm also looking a little bit ahead when natural gas starts to be less attractive, using some existing natural gas piping.
So Art, there's probably two or three slash comments and questions in that, and I'll just offer a few thoughts. First off, I made reference to the importance of heat mapping, that understanding where your heat sources are and where your heat demand is. And in the heat sources, there are a number of what would typically be called low-grade heat sources, such as sewage, that are all potential viable energy sources. It is possible that you would need to couple in heat pump technology to upgrade those low-grade heat sources to be viable for building heating, but the technology to do this exists. I would just offer this comparison of what happens in Europe. For example, by legislation, and certainly in Germany, and I believe at the EU now level, that municipalities are required by law to develop heat maps. They've got to understand where their heat sources are, and have heat strategies for how you're going to deliver that heat to that city's district energy systems. So essentially requiring the whole municipal thinking, value, as we highlighted in one of our recommendations, that residual heat is actually a strategic resource. You want to use it smartly. I know, and perhaps I'd give Martin an opportunity. I know that Boltzmann and McMaster's Institute for Energy Studies have some funding from the Net Zero Advisory Body to be doing some work in this space. But Martin, I realize this mapping going on quite extensively. Could you just perhaps interject and give a comment or two on work that's going on around the heat mapping part? You there, Martin?
Oh. Activate your camera and speaker, Martin.
Okay, so we'll see if we get Martin online here in a moment here, Art. The comment, I would say the comment on natural gas, the first and most important piece of natural gas is actually rights of way, because all of that infrastructure exists on a certain footprint, and the ability to use those same rights of way for installing the water piping is an opportunity here. So because of course the gas network goes to all the same buildings where we're wanting thermal networks to go to. I don't believe you'd find that the use of the gas piping would be sufficient, because it's not the right diameters of piping to deal with hot water movement. But what is important is the rights of way. Art, how do I do with your two?
I think you've done very well. I thought that was excellent, what's happening in Europe. I did just want to make a quick comment as well, that last night I was reading an article on air source heat pumps that are operational down to minus 35 degrees C. So that technology is moving ahead, and that's just a side comment.
So
thank you.
So there's no question it's the space to watch of where air source heat pumps are going, what manufacturers claim, what's in use in operation. it's also a question of what's called the coefficient of performance of the heat pump at these low temperatures. For just a moment here, the coefficient of performance, which is the measure of for unit energy, electricity going to the heat pump, what's the unit of energy that's actually delivered. And a typical ground source heat pump will have COPs that are factors of 4 to 6 or higher. Air source heat pumps, you're doing good if you can get 1 to 1.5 at temperatures below -20. And in other words, it's almost resistive heating. So, but 5 degrees, if you can move that coefficient of performance a little lower by even 5 degrees, it makes a difference. So,
I just comment that my ground source heat pump, the lowest I've seen the COP is 4.2, and I've seen it as high as 17. So
yeah, and this is why, of course, the geography requires you have the footprint to be able to put down the ground source heat pump field, and that is problematic in urban areas here, Art. So hence our view is that use ground source heat pumps in rural Canada for sure, and thermal networks with some electrification in urban areas. That's kind of the principle here. But
okay, and a comment from Martin Green. He is telling me that Zoom is not allowing him to unmute. So
oh, sorry to hear, Martin.
he's kind of stranded, and I don't know what to do to get him turned on.
Okay, so Martin, you'll have to just take it, and you can tell me how I'm wrong after the fact. Okay, so
Well, Martin, you can also, if you wish, put a comment in the chat, but that might take a while to type in.
okay.
So I was going to defer to Martin, but I guess we've just seen he can't get onto a speaker. So on deck is, next is Dave Pollock, and on deck is Raymond Lurie.
Hi, Dave.
Good. Thanks, Bob, for a fascinating presentation. Two questions from different points of view. My daughter has a responsibility to do a report on the state of the bay, meaning the Georgian Bay, every 5 years. And I was just thinking about the educational effort that's required to get publics on board for this kind of new technology, if in fact they will get on board. And so I wondered, did you have an idea of the effect of all of this extra heating, which is being pumped into the bay? The movement of invasive species is really of some great concern, and it's linked to the temperatures of the water, of course. Do you have any references to the temperature changes from all of the heating that gets pumped into the Great Lakes?
And Dave, not off the top. I do not have at the top of my mind here right now. But let me just say that the number one environmental issue that Bruce Power has, the number one environmental issue, is the rejection of waste heat into Lake Huron.
Mm-hmm.
That is it. Now, you've heard the announcement made by the provincial government that is to put close to 5,000 megawatts of new electricity into that site. Well, that's about another 10,000 megawatts thermal going into the lake.
Yes.
And there's other ways you can do this. You can use cooling towers. One has seen typical, the big image of nuclear plants you have in many sites around the world is the big cooling towers with the steam coming off it. So you can go to air cooling systems. But this is a big issue, and by using some of that, taking a big thermal corridor out of the Bruce site to service, for example, to service the blossoming greenhouse industry in southern Ontario, is moving some of that heat going into Georgian Bay into use that is value to society. So I don't have the numbers. Others would, but just say that pragmatically, the idea with thermal networks and heat corridors is that thermal corridors is that you actually help mitigate the environmental impact of rejected heat from nuclear power plants, and that's the positive.
Bob, thanks for that. And the second question, Peter asked it right off the top about the levels of support. So I won't re-ask that, but presumably Toronto, I don't have a sense when you were speaking of the size and the impact of this N-Wave project, but presumably there's been some provincial funding or support or political support for that Toronto project getting into the works. What size, what effect will that be in terms of how much heating will be reduced in its need from other sources once that project is completed?
Wow, I don't, Martin, if Martin could type that into chat, that might be helpful here, because I don't actually have that 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 number here.
So I'm trying to get an idea of the kind of political support that already exists and what tasks remain.
So there's two sides. One, of course, is the political support for thermal networks. A second is political support for connecting thermal networks to nuclear power plants or SMRs in the community. And I think it's appropriate that we perhaps say that those are thermal networks don't need nuclear energy, and nuclear energy doesn't need thermal networks.
Right.
So I think the first issue is socialization of the opportunity with thermal networks. And what the benefits they provide relative to gas, and then the opportunities that could accrue when you bring couple a nuclear power plant, small or large, to a thermal network. So I think there's actually two conversations there, Dave. I note that the Hamilton Thermal Network Company is looking at building what is called Ontario's heat corridor or thermal corridor in the Hamilton Toronto area, and using a number of heat sources, including the steel mills in Hamilton as part of the energy sources here. So a lot is happening in this space. There's I just see. Okay, see, I've got a response from Martin, and he didn't quite hear your comment here, Dave, so he missed it here. But yeah, people can go online and see Martin's comments to the questions around heat pump efficiency at low temperatures.
Yeah, I'll read those out, Bob.
Say again?
I'll read out Martin's comments after you're finished here with
Okay.
David.
Yeah. So Dave, I'm kind of not giving I guess the point is that this information exists. I believe that N-Wave and others in the thermal network community are actively engaged at a provincial level and municipal level. I would say that I have heard on good authority that Enbridge is seriously considering becoming a thermal network company. It is currently a gas network company, but why not move to become also a thermal network company? There's some really big opportunities here, and there's industries, big players that are seriously looking at this, is perhaps the message.
Well, it's all helpful. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, Raymond, just before I turn it to you, I'll just read what Martin has added to Robert's request earlier. He's got two answers here. The first one is wastewater can supply up to about 10% of needed heat, which is slightly less than the percentage of heat that is used for hot water. And the second response that he provided is air source heat pumps can operate at below minus 25 C, but their combined heat and power drops to less than drops 1.5 or less, often less than 1. They also have greatly reduced heat output capacity. From a practical perspective, on average, for heat pumps of average age and typical installation, it is not worthwhile operating ASHR below minus 8C. At lower temperatures, one should assume that greenhouse gas free heat is provided by electric resistance at COP equals 1. Any
Right.
response, Bob?
Well, these are the numbers I'm familiar with getting from Martin and his colleagues here. It's tough for air source heat pumps is the bottom line at low temperatures. The question is, what's your backup? A lot of the current installations, of course, people are keeping their natural gas furnace and they're using it as the backup when it's really cold. But then you've got to essentially maintain your gas infrastructure for those circumstances, and that ultimately will have an affordability impact.
Martin has also just added another comment, Raymond, just a moment here. And he says in many US states, gas companies are now required to provide heat through community geothermal systems. So there's things moving in a significant direction to some of the questions and comments that have been raised about the role of the natural gas companies in their distribution networks. So over to you. And do you want to say anything about that, Bob?
No, that's fine here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Over to you, Raymond.
Raymond.
And Richard Vanderjagt, you're on the next on the sheet.
Thanks, Bob, for a really interesting presentation. I put a lot of comments, actually, or a lot of questions. Some of them have been answered, like the one about Enbridge. But the first one I asked, though, is Bruce is quite far from any urban area, but you mentioned that there's a possibility of heating farms like greenhouses, yeah. This is one of my beef with people who think that local is better than stuff grown in California, because the transportation GHGs are probably a lot less than heating a hot house during the winter with natural gas. But my point is, so you talked about other sources of heat, which was again part of what I wanted to ask. So there's steel plants, there's cement plants. So there is some people looking at other sources of heat and integrating all of these into networks that would be assumedly. So for Hamilton, there's no nuclear plant close to Hamilton as far as I know, and there's a limit to how far you could do this, right? So I guess my question is, what else is being done to look at other sources, and Bruce in particular, what can we do with Bruce, right?
So to begin on Bruce, frankly, one has to do the engineering analysis. I mean, you can move heat, and there are cases in Europe where they're considering moving heat from nuclear power plants as far as 200 kilometers. But the more heat you're moving, the more the economics work, right? So it's a question of what is the customer to use that heat, and do the economics work here? So, the Bruce site is 150 kilometers from a large heat source. You get into Southern Ontario communities, so it's on the margin. I think if you bring in an idea such as where greenhouse food production is going in Ontario, maybe it's a kind of a synergistic discussion to be having, of saying, well, maybe it's not where the greenhouses are going in the London St. Thomas kind of corridor. Maybe it's about creating another set of opportunities a bit norther, but because you've got a heat source so maybe there's a new opportunity there. What I can say is in Europe, it is standard practice that there's a number of industrial sites, a number of chemical companies, for example, whose profitability actually depends on the use of residual heat from those industries servicing local district energy systems. And so this is there's money to be made with all of this heat that we're otherwise thrown in the environment. There are customers for it. That's us, and the economics can work. But we have, obviously one has to create the infrastructure for allowing that heat to go from source to customer. But the ways to do that is available technology off the shelf. So, this comes back into this concept I've talked to a few times, which is about the heat mapping. You've got to understand where your sources are, where your demand is, and how to connect it together. And there's lots of opportunity. I showed you one chart from the McMaster Institute with all of the various industrial sources through to things like sewers and whatnot that play into this. Yeah,
Because
lots
yeah,
out there.
so I guess that's why there's so many dots on that. I was wondering how come there were so many dots on that chart. So that explains that.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I have other questions, but maybe I'll let Richard go first.
Oh, my question is very simple. Thanks. Just very quick question, and that's: is the modeling is your aim eventually to eliminate the need for natural gas?
It is.
Okay.
It is. I mean, I think that ultimately it is the GHG problem, and how do we eliminate it? But here's the challenge, Richard. We've got to eliminate it, but at the end of the day, we need to provide affordable, reliable, resilient, and secure energy to our customers. And the rub with heat is you need it when it's worst. You think about those times when the polar vortex was putting temperatures at bottom scales across North America. That's when you need the heat, and you've got to build your system to do it. So we think the concept of thermal networks is a potential game changer in how to approach it. And frankly, it's exactly the path that Northern Europe, cold countries are going. We can learn from them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to ask a question, if I may, and then I'll refer to another posting by Martin. My question, Bob, is in rolling out these types of thermal networks, are there lessons to be learned from the original rollout of natural gas distribution? Since it had to make a business case to do it, and it's done it. Now we're talking about thermal networks. Is there a business case that we can learn from in regard to what the natural gas distribution system has been able to achieve? Recognizing the very important fact that they now have the a right of way to virtually every building in certainly a large metropolitan area. So that's a great advantage from a thermal networks point of view in terms of the right of way, should they wish to move into that business area.
So Peter, this is a very very astute question. I think to me, for a layman, the message here is over a period of between 20 and 30 years, we rolled out a national natural gas infrastructure that is safe, reliable, and robust. And what we're talking about doing is rolling out thermal networks over a similar time frame that have those same characteristics. And I would argue that at first blush, the issues of dealing with moving water in networks is actually a less demanding challenge than moving gas. So I think the point is we've done it, it's worked, and we're in many ways we're looking at replicating what we've done. And it is a distribution system that is essentially the same footprint as the natural gas network, essentially the same footprint. So the bottom line here is we've done it before, why can't we do it again? And the other important point that I've made a few times in my talk, but it's used to coming back to here, is that that we don't pay for our natural gas. We don't pay as a resident, as a homeowner. We don't pay to Enbridge a capital cost to connect to a gas network. It's built into our monthly rates, and as well as that whole infrastructure that they've had to build here. And so for the homeowners to say, okay, I'm going to electrify building heating, but what it means I got to buy a heat pump. Well, no, you want to connect to a thermal network, and the thermal network company, the Enbridge thermal network, whatever, will come into your home, install the units, and you've got heat and hot water, and that infrastructure is actually owned by the thermal network company. So you're paying in your monthly rates, but you're not having to deal with the capital outlay. So I think this notion of a utility model is also enormously important in the concept here, just as the gas network uses the utility model.
Okay, thank you. Just one more thing, then I'll end this session. We'll turn to the open discussion. Martin also had another opportunity to post, and he says, as far as I know, Enwave is not pursuing political support for large-scale thermal networks. Most district energy companies in Canada are pursuing low-hanging fruit, which is generally new developments. But thermal networks need to be expanded to most existing buildings. Any comment on that? I guess that's pretty clear.
So I think that, so a point that my colleagues at Boltzmann and my colleagues at McMaster repeatedly make is this notion that we need to think about district energy systems on steroids, the concept of thermal networks, as an infrastructure. This is an infrastructure, and it's a critical infrastructure. So it is about a suitable marriage of public and private investment that is meeting both a commercial opportunity but also a public good. And those models, just as the build out of natural gas was a public infrastructure, just as electricity grids, then it's about sharing the cost between ratepayers and taxpayers. And that concept needs to be applied to thermal networks just as it's been to electricity grids and gas grids.
Thank you. I guess you can hear rolling thunder here, because I can feel my house vibrating. So I'd like to turn now to Ted to thank the speaker, and thank you, Bob, for your excellent presentation. Over to you, Ted.
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. Every time I hear you, I think it's wonderful. I'm glad you're still helping us understand a holistic approach to how we actually provide energy. And we have a lot of it out right now. If anybody could actually figure out how to tame thunder and use it, we have a large supply right now in Ottawa. As a matter of fact, for those of you on the West End, there is a tornado warning right now at the west end of Ottawa and out near Kinburn. So I'd be careful. Some of these lines may go off. But that said, it was definitely worthwhile, and I'm glad we survived the storm, at least up to now, because we got to hear a lot of very good ideas about things where synergies can help us. I'm reminded of stuff that was happening, in fact, in China when I was working there, and they finally developed long-range real at ambient temperature transmissions, which has now allowed them to take wherever they produce energy to almost anywhere else with almost lossless amounts. So therefore, whatever you do with it at one place, you can probably send it elsewhere, at least electrically. And that may be in our future, although right now the investment necessary to do that is beyond a state the size of Canada. Anyway, we'll talk about that in future when it becomes a little more realistic for us. So once again, thank you very much, Bob. It's been wonderful. And we benefit every week with a very holistic and wise sharing of ideas, which broadens all of us. So thank you again.
My pleasure.
So here comes the commercial. And Bob, you don't get to say thanks again. You've given us too much thanks just providing it. Just saying to people, if you want to watch this, it will be online via our website very shortly. It will also be available via YouTube. And we would also encourage people who are not members, please join. That's what allows us to pay for the computer and the help that we need to make this keep happening. Because we are getting more and more people seriously interested, and the caliber of the talks that we get is usually really good and really stimulates everybody who's here. So thank you again. And in future, please, if you do go on YouTube, say you like it. It never hurts what we do. So thank you again. Have yourself a very pleasant and safe week, and stay out of the thunderstorms.